How active have Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham been in support of Ukraine?
They've been incredibly active, and I would shout out Senator Graham as well as being one of the strongest Republican voices on support for Ukraine. The Republican Party, we have to be honest, is split, even if the minority of voices is just that a minority in Congress. It has had an effect on the Republican electorate, and so I really commend Lindsey Graham for continuing to support Ukraine. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but even before that, along with the Democrats and led by Richard Blumenthal and other senators, and of course President Biden as well, in strong, especially military support for Ukraine.
And their recent proposal has a unique aspect to it, which you pointed out in your article. The prospect of a strategic economic partnership between the United States and Ukraine, which would be focused on metals and rare earth elements development. Do you think this proposal has a chance to succeed? And if so, why?
Yeah, this was the most interesting part of their press release, which talked a lot about security, about inviting Ukraine to NATO, about reducing or eliminating restrictions on Ukrainian use of U.S. weapons against Russia, things of that nature, which most people who think we should have a much stronger policy on Ukraine already know and are thinking about and agree with. But it's interesting because US-Ukraine trade is really small. In 2022, I think it was about $3 billion in total. I mean, that's minuscule, really. But this initiative and idea is interesting because they want to base this US-Ukraine economic agreement or trade agreement on the development and export of rare earth elements and strategic metals from Ukraine to the US and the West, which, of course, these things are key to high-end technologies, chips that go into enabling AI, go into things like iPhones, but also batteries, right? Lithium goes into batteries, which will be key for the energy transition. And so the senators initially propose a working group to kind of sort through the initial issues on this and to see where an agreement can be agreed upon, which is sensible. This will, of course, if this were to come to pass, would take place over many months and possibly years if we were to get an agreement on this. But I think it does have legs because one of the things that's even more bipartisan in the US Congress than support for Ukraine is opposition to the Chinese Communist Party's rise and its aggressive actions against United States allies. And we know that China has a near monopoly currently on the rare earths market. And so reducing American, especially, reliance on China for these kinds of elements would be a huge positive for both Republicans and Democrats who all see this as an issue. So I think there's a lot to like in a potential, if this were to become a bill, and it certainly would be a sensible next step to do exactly what the senators outline and to start a working group on these issues.
So overall, then, what would be the significance for foreign trade of a U.S.-Ukraine partnership in this area, and in other areas for that matter?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, Ukraine and U.S. trade is quite small, but I think especially there's a lot of new defense cooperation and the potential for new metals and rare earth elements cooperation could see that trade skyrocket, double, triple in the next 10 years or so. We have this US-Ukraine security agreement that President Biden and President Zelensky agreed to, which talks about all sorts of interoperability, US investment in Ukraine's defense sector, Ukraine's own development of its indigenous defense technologies, some of which I imagine would also be useful to the US military. So I think there's a lot of new synergies in the relationship around minerals, metals, defense cooperation that beyond the of course, crucial strategic and security ties could also be a basis for further economic cooperation.
And as a follow-on to agreement you just mentioned, Senators Blumenthal and Graham also announced that Blumenthal would introduce the Stand with Ukraine Act when Congress returns to Capitol Hill in September to quote unquote codify the bilateral security agreement that Biden and Zelensky had reached in June. Why is this necessary? And do you think Congress will pass the bill in the fall?
So the bilateral security agreement between the US and Ukraine is one of many that Ukraine has bilaterally agreed with all sorts of its partners and allies. There's more than a dozen, maybe even 2 dozen at this point, depending on when this episode comes out. We might even have more by the time your listeners hear this. But essentially, the agreement, I would say, builds upon current US and Ukraine strategic and security ties, provides for further US training of Ukrainian troops, increases in interoperability, more cooperation in cybersecurity and cyber defense, and other things of that nature. It's really an extensive package over 10 years. And the difficult thing, though, is that it's not a law, right? So if you could have a new president or a new administration in Kyiv, or, probably more likely in the near term in Washington, that there's nothing binding about the agreement. And so what the senators are proposing is to essentially make this law, that the US and Ukraine must do these kinds of things that converge our security establishments, especially, and provide essentially greater security, not guarantees, but something approaching guarantees that allow Ukraine to better integrate with Western defense structures, which of course is a major positive. I'll be honest, I'm not fully sure if this will is much more than a symbolic gesture. I think in part because politics in Washington, the Senate, controlled by the Democrats, I think would likely be interested in this. This will come out of committee, but I think it's less clear on the House side. And then, of course, if we were to really codify this as a sort of treaty, this would also need to be passed in Kyiv, which might be an easy pass in the Verkhovna Rada, but would be an extra step as well. So there's lots to kind of figure out before this becomes a law.